next subject. Vices. Good or bad? Discuss.
Vices good or bad?
Always good.
Good vice.
Always good. Always good.
Never good, by definition. Vice is the opposite of virtue. Virtue is good. Actually, the word virtue, we'll come on to vice in a minute, but the word virtue comes from the Latin word for man, V-I-R.
As in virile.
As in virile, yeah. But it's not man as opposed to woman necessarily, it's man as opposed to animal.
Okay.
So what makes you virtuous and this goes back to sort of Machiavelli and people like that, so this is sort of Renaissance thinking about vice and virtue. What makes you virtuous is that you are more like a man, i.e. a human, and less like a beast. So you become more virtuous by rising above bestial, animal-like characteristics. So instead of eating, say, 3 croissants of a morning, as some people might do, some people we know might do, you would rise above those animal urges and instead spend your days in the sort of divine contemplation of God or reason.
What is the classical appropriation of the word vice in that case?
It comes from the word to turn. So a vice is a turning away from the good.
Obviously a vice is also a different kind of turning.
A turning mechanism. But vice means a deviation essentially. So,
it's interesting because I talk about deviation offline all the time.
All right, well there you go. So vice is a kind of deviation. And it has those religious connotations or moral connotations rather, because a vice is a turning away from the good. And a virtue is a rising above the
interesting.
Animal. Yeah. So yeah.
You're smarter than you look.
That's not smarter, that's just I remember a few things from Latin etymology.
Listen, I don't have any kind of grasp of that kind of thing at all, actually. But it is interesting to talk about, obviously, different manifestations of virtue and vice, rather than obviously the kind of, I suppose, classical description.
Yeah.
So in terms of, obviously, virtue, how would you say you have demonstrated your virtue?
So there's virtue in the modern sense, obviously, has nothing to do, well, we don't think of it as kind of rising above our bestial nature. Though I do think we associate virtue with being good, or goodness. So we are virtuous when we are good. But I think often that goodness is understood as a form of self-denial. So you're virtuous when you abstain from smoking or drinking or from too much sex or infidelity or lying or whatever. So it's virtue and self-denial seem to go together in a way.
So actually, I read an amazing book, which I do recommend, actually. I recommend actually everybody watching this, called Strangers Drowning by a woman called Larissa McFarquharson, who's a journalist, I think. And it's a remarkable book. It's basically about people who lead incredibly selfless lives. People who've actually given away all their worldly possessions because somehow they feel compelled to make their mark on the world or to recognize other people suffering more than them. So people actually are able to literally live in the most ascetic circumstances whereby they have virtually no possessions or any kind of accoutrements of modern life and actually feel as though they are doing everybody a favor. Now, take another extreme. There was an example of a man who came from a prosperous family, obviously had a very strong sense of public duty, who ended up running a major leper colony for literally 30, 40 years. Now, it's very interesting to see at what point the desire to demonstrate virtue can, as I would put it, overshoot the runway. You can just go too far. You think actually we have actually landed and people are still going. You made your point, we've arrived at the destination, and yet there's a continual desire.
It reminds me of a woman I helped once, for want of a better phrase, who came with one particular issue, but in fact, in the course of describing her issue, let it be known that she was also meditating 4 hours a day. That's quite a lot of meditating.
You meditate?
Sporadically. And for her, it was a kind of form of virtue to be meditating that much.
What's virtue about meditating?
Well, because you are...
very selfish, you're just doing something for yourself.
Well, yeah, I guess that's one way of understanding it. But I think, certainly in her perspective, it was a bit like prayer, really. And in fact, she came from a very religious background, grew up in a kind of Catholic religion. So it was a kind of secular version of prayer, essentially. Anyway, to your point of overshooting the runway, she was meditating so much or being so virtuous. In fact, she was quite unhappy and she was sort of cutting herself off from lots of other kind of pleasures, physical pleasures actually, sexual and food-related pleasures. And actually the best thing she could do was the opposite, to cut down on that self-denial. In fact, she did and became a lot happier.